Alrighty, friends. Welcome back to the Esoteric Beat, Terence, McKenna, and Alchemy Part 2. Thanks those of you who attended my rambly lecture in the last episode. This one's going to be a little bit more coherent, a little bit more short and sweet. So I'm still working on my chapter. My deadline looms. I've asked for a little bit of extra time, and hopefully I will get that extra time. Otherwise, I got to have it in day after tomorrow. So still a quick turnaround on feedback if you want it to be incorporated into my first draft. But I understand this is my first academic publication. I don't really know what I'm doing here. But I understand I'm going to have some time to like revise. So I need to get something written that is finished with all the footnotes and everything, but there will be room for polishing. So, maybe a couple of weeks turnaround if you have more thoughtful, considered comments. So let me see. I'm sharing my screen here. And so here's what I got written. I'm going to just go ahead and lay on you this introduction that I have written. I have a couple of notes here about what this doesn't say that I'd like to say about the kind of, significance of Francis Yates for what Terence McKenna is selling as the spiritual use of psychedelics, what Graham St. John calls his psychedelic occultism. Although he made his bread and butter from speaking gigs in the last decade of his life, Terence McKenna announced that he was tired of talking about drugs. Instead of giving his usual talks, McKenna would show up to seminars at places like Esalen prepared to talk about alchemy, and instructed his audience to read Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition by Francis Yates. In this chapter, I will argue that reading Francis Yates made a substantial impact on McKenna's bardic rap, especially in terms of his critique of modern science. And I was just looking at my notes, and I noticed Terence McKenna studied under Paul Feyerabend. I don't know if I got the name right. I don't even know if his first name was Paul, but he studied under Feyerabend at UC Berkeley. So, McKenna was actually involved with, a professor who was like a really significant critic in the philosophy of science, history of science. Of what McKenna calls in the Alchemical Dream video constipated reason, right? So McKenna kind of had some chops. He knew a little bit what he was talking about when it comes to the critique of modern science, right? Um, Building on his interest that he had since he was a teenager in Jungian psychological readings of alchemy, as well as Mircea Eliade's connection between alchemy and shamanism, McKenna engaged with the Yates thesis that the development of modern science owed a great deal to the alchemical or magical worldview. In particular, he takes up the idea from Yates that the scientific revolution was responsible for an exteriorization of the orientation of self and world that he situates as coming out of alchemy and magic, right? I need to add that. And the importance of Rene Descartes. The period of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, celebrated by Yates in her book by that name, gives McKenna maybe I should say disclosed instead of celebrate, um, gives McKenna a model for psychedelic counterculture, and he exhorts his audience to look into the chemical worldview for solutions to modern problems. This is, how science created patriarchy and prohibition, and climate apocalypse. McKenna can be situated in a tradition of countercultural exponents of alchemy who compare the mystical language and symbolism of spiritual alchemy to the psychedelic experience. This means that we will need to do some scholarly throat clearing concerning the historiography of spiritual alchemy and the role that scholars in the history of science now understand that alchemy did indeed have in the development of the scientific revolution. So, spiritual alchemy has been a vexed issue in the scholarship of alchemy, at least since the 1960s, as we shall see. But a definitive statement by history of science scholars was made by Principi and Newman in their article, Some Problems with the Historiography of Alchemy, 2001. In this article, Principi and Newman grapple with the problem of spiritual alchemy that they claim has plagued the history of alchemy, bleeding over from occultist misunderstandings into the pages of historians. This is also kind of based on like the 17th, 18th century polemic against alchemy that like proto scientists were making, right, trying to spin alchemy. And Terence is hit to this. Terence says, right, alchemy is not a throwback, but it's a prelude to modern science. I've got that at 3525 in those Hermeticism and alchemy lectures. That's 3525 in the tape, 35 minutes and 25 seconds in on the YouTube video, which you can go look up. It's the one that's labeled Hermeticism and Alchemy. I believe it was May 1991. The idea is that alchemy never represented legitimate chemical knowledge, but rather represents a sort of esoteric meditation. And I think that McKenna just like reeks of this problem, but at the same time, McKenna appreciates that alchemists were involved with matter, and I want to kind of like complicate it there. Principia and Newman trace this misunderstanding back to 19th century occultism, the figure of Marianne Atwood, but a good deal of the blame also rests on C.G. Jung, who claimed that alchemy was not about or was not primarily about chemical experimentation, but rather a sort of projection of psychic contents onto the laboratory. I should probably use the exact text from Jung and maybe a quote from NNP here. Okay, so before I let you go, we're making a quick video here, but I wanted to go over real quick just my elevator pitch outline for what I'm going to be doing. And this is hopefully containing a kind of nugget of the argument, right? And so McKenna got tired of talking about drugs, shifted to talks on alchemy. His seminar homework was Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. The Rosicrucian Enlightenment was the model for psychedelic counterculture. And that my argument is basically McKenna's engagement with Francis Yates was substantial. And this is like, and I want to add something about how it's like significant for esoteric studies, for understanding like how McKenna was getting engaged with esoteric studies, how he was influencing his audience. But really, this paper is more about the influence of Yates on McKenna than it is about McKenna's influence. But I do want to say something in my conclusion about like if we're going to work out his influence on the counterculture, helps us to get straight on the kind of spiritual alchemy he was sort of preaching. Terence McKenna followed Yates, and seeing the Rosicrucian Enlightenment as an early modern alchemical utopia. I should, maybe have a paragraph about what Yates said. But mostly I think I'm going to be just kind of following what McKenna said in his lectures. And really, the more I work on this, the more I revise it, it's the best thing I can be doing is stay close to the text and just do a patient recounting of what Terence McKenna is doing, and then fill that in with what I know as a deep reader of Yates and her scene. The Neville Drury interview has the definition of alchemy, which I believe I read in video number 1. The idea of the redemption of the world through magic. I have there's a video labeled "A Dose of Alchemical Thinking" that might actually be the same lecture. I haven't gotten straight. I could have been doing a better job of like the manuscript collating, kind of like figuring out where these lectures were held and on what date, and cite it better. I need to do a lot more legwork there. And if I continue with this project, and write a book about McKenna and alchemy, maybe I'll catalog them, or maybe I'll go hang out with the catalogers. Terence McKenna said mushroom trippers have the philosopher's stone. This needs to be in like my first few sentences. Mushroom trippers already have the philosopher's stone, right? And like looking at Yates helps understand like he was so into alchemy that it gets huge into this particular phase of alchemy that Francis Yates wrote about, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. He's so into it, he makes a video. In his last film, The Alchemical Dream, he plays Dr. John Dee. And he's basically like doing propaganda for the Yates thesis, as one of the kind of quips I made today when I was writing about it. So the critique of science, I definitely want to get into how he drops Feyerabend's name. Science is responsible for these 3 problems that McKenna thinks are the biggest, right? Climate apocalypse, patriarchy, and prohibition. Science suppresses wonder, and that's why science rejects the psychedelic experience. Science rejects psychedelics for the same reasons as alchemy. I'm going to just write that in. So McKenna is disclosing a forbidden religious truth. So we situate McKenna in the spiritual alchemy historiography problem. We can talk about spiritual alchemy and the counterculture. Before McKenna, we have Rexroth, Metzner, and Watts. I love my 3s. Playing with Mercury as a child, I was operating as an alchemist. I think I'm going to like extensively cite his account of being a kid. And, this really gives him a sense, alchemy is not so much an esoteric meditation, but about learning. So I mean, this complicates what Newman and Principi think. The problem in the historiography was seeing alchemy as an esoteric meditation and not chemistry. So McKenna does say, like the fact that alchemy led to modern chemistry is sort of almost a footnote. It's like not the most important thing, and that's not why he's into alchemy. He's sort of like wants to go look at alchemy to like figure out how we can get around the problems of modern science, right? Okay. So I mean, it's like he still wants to do inquiry. He wants to inquire about the world. He wants to do the kinds of things that science is in the is has monopolized, is in the business of doing, but he thinks that science isn't doing it right. So what Jung taught the world about alchemy, Terence McKenna does say somewhere that Jung sort of like showed the world that this is what alchemy was really about, right? Jung proved this, and I think that's really important in terms of the historiography argument. We've got a nice long quote about this wonderful book by Eliade, The Forge and the Crucible, where McKenna recommends the Eliade theory. Yeats and Descartes, I've got some quotes from Descartes, and Yeats even suggests that maybe Descartes was like influenced by the Hermetic um, revelation, and then McKenna has this thing on Descartes' alchemical angel, and how Descartes had this like vision of an angel. So once again, here's a place where there's like kind of a direct correlation between what Yeats is doing with Descartes and what McKenna's doing with Descartes in the Yeats lecture. So, but it seems like her view of Descartes' meaning for the scientific revolution and the change out of the alchemical worldview. I mean, it seems like the Yeats theory is McKenna's picking it up and running with it, and it's having an impact on his rap. And the other thing about his rap that I do want to talk about, if you listen to the State of the Stone and the Seeking the Stone lectures, he titled his lectures in an alchemical fashion, but then doesn't get around to talking about alchemy much. He says in the State of the Stone, well, I see this as these kind of talks as or these seminars, that he gave at places like Esalen as a sort of a State of the Stone address. Um, and he means the philosopher's stone of alchemy, but then he doesn't really talk about alchemy much in the lecture, and maybe he was intending to talk about alchemy but just sort of meanders into his own trip. um, Other places in the alchemy lectures he's explaining his theory of the end of history and the way that history is the shockwave of eschatology or whatever, the way that the future is kind of pulling back into the past. It's kind of a Phil Dickian thing. um, he does explain alchemy in those terms, or like he uses alchemical language to kind of like do his own trip, which reminds me of what Phil Dick is doing in Valis, where he uses the homoplasmate uh, and says that the alchemists were looking for his science fictional thing. In the same way that Terence McKenna will say, well, alchemy helps explain my trip about history. I talked a little bit about D and the Alchemical Dream film. Yates thought it was really important that Johann Andre was a was influenced by these English playwrights, and she thinks that D was such an important crypto influence on the Rosicrucians, right? This like underground influence. And McKenna says um, Meyer and Andre were advisors to Frederick or Rudolph, one of those alchemical court. And he devoted an entire lecture to the mysterious deconnected Voynich manuscript. Now, Terence McKenna has a theory here, which is really fun, where there is this manuscript that John Dee apparently puzzled over that was covered in hieroglyphics. According to his son Arthur Dee, he would puzzle over this, and McKenna has this whole theory that I'll have to quote kind of at length. That Dee pawned the Voynich manuscript off to Rudolph II as if it were a Roger Bacon manuscript and made a bunch of money. Right. So my conclusion, where was I? Shoot. In conclusion, Yeats was a substantial influence on Terence McKenna's understanding of alchemy as an element of his critique of science. Now, I have a ton more that I could do, and if anybody's interested, leave me a comment, shoot me a note, and I'll record another video if you guys are enjoying this. Do let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to labor on getting my chapter written up. Thanks so much for coming. Welcome your input as usual. I'm ted.hand at gmail.com.